It all started last year when my work situation began to decline. I had been at my job for years, but suddenly things started going wrong. Staff cuts, reduced hours, and eventually I was laid off. My savings quickly ran out. With each passing day, the sense of desperation grew. With bills piling up and the rent on my old place becoming unsustainable, I had no choice but to look for a cheaper place to live. I spent weeks searching for something I could afford until I finally found an apartment that fit my tight budget. It was one of the oldest buildings in the city and honestly looked like it was falling apart, but it was either that or living on the streets. On moving day, I looked at the building and felt a chill run down my spine. It had a worn-out appearance, with dirty walls and cracks everywhere. However, it wasn't the appearance that bothered me. There was something about that place, a palpable sense of life of its own. Every time I looked at it, it seemed like the building was breathing, watching. When I finally entered the building, the feeling of unease only intensified. The hallway was poorly lit and smelled of mold. I could hear every step echoing off the walls, every creak of the floorboards, as if the building was alive and aware of my every move. On the first day, I met the building manager, Mark. He was a middle-aged man, short, always with a sweaty and nervous appearance. Mark seemed friendly enough, at least initially. He showed me the apartment with a smile, talking about the building's history and assuring me that I would find comfort there. But even in that first meeting, something felt off. There was a strange glint in Mark's eyes, something that made me feel uneasy. As the days went by, the atmosphere of the building began to affect me more deeply. Little details started to stand out, the sound of footsteps when I was alone, whispers that seemed to come from the walls, and that constant feeling of being watched. It didn't take long for me to realize that my new home would be much more than I had expected, a true nightmare. As soon as I moved in, I ran into Mark again. He appeared in the hallway while I was awkwardly trying to carry boxes into my new apartment. He smiled, that same friendly smile, but this time it seemed a bit forced. He offered to help, and despite my instinct telling me to decline, I accepted the help. While we worked, he asked trivial questions about me, where I was from, what I did for a living, and how I had found the building. I answered cautiously, feeling like every word was being carefully analyzed by him. There was something strange about Mark that I couldn't quite put my finger on. His eyes never seemed to focus directly on me, always slightly averted, as if he were watching something just behind me. After we finished moving the boxes, he insisted on giving me a tour of the apartment. Apparently, he wanted to make sure everything was in order. As we moved from room to room, he talked about the building's history, mentioning that it was one of the oldest in the city, full of character. While he spoke, I began to notice small things, a dark stain on the ceiling that seemed to move, a crack in the wall that hadn't been there when I first visited. When we reached the kitchen, Mark paused and turned to me, his smile fading. "Have you heard about the previous tenants?" he asked, his voice suddenly lower and more serious. I shook my head, surprised by the change in tone. He continued, "Some say the building is peculiar, but they're just stories, of course. Don't let it bother you." I tried to laugh, but the sound came out forced. The conversation left an uneasiness that I couldn't shake. After the tour, Mark left, leaving me alone in the apartment. Finally, I closed the door and looked around. The place felt different now, darker, heavier. As the days passed, I started to notice subtle changes in Mark's behavior. He showed up on my floor more often, always with an excuse to be around, checking maintenance, delivering mail, or just to see how I was settling in. His initial friendly demeanor began to feel like a facade, a mask he wore to hide something much more sinister. Nights were the worst. Alone in the apartment, I heard sounds I couldn't explain. Footsteps that seemed to come from the hallway even when I knew no one was there. Whispers that seemed to emerge from the walls, and that constant, oppressive feeling of being watched. With each passing day, the sense of unease grew, and I began to realize that my decision to move into that place had been a terrible mistake. Things started to spiral out of control when the inexplicable events became more frequent and intense. On the first night, I heard footsteps in the hallway. It sounded like someone was pacing back and forth, but when I looked, no one was there. Over time, the sounds grew louder and more disturbing. Banging on the walls, muffled laughter, and even whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. One night, I woke up with the sensation that someone was in my room. The air was cold and heavy, and I could feel a presence beside me. I quickly turned on the light, but there was nothing there. However, the feeling that I wasn't alone remained. I started sleeping with the light on, but it didn't help much. The shadows on the walls seemed to move, and the noises continued. I decided I needed to find out more about the building and about Mark. I went to the city library and researched old archives and newspapers. What I discovered was disturbing. The building had a long history of strange and tragic events. There were several reports of unexplained disappearances, suicides, and fatal accidents. Each one seemed to be connected to the apartment where I was living. As I dug deeper, I found out that Mark was involved in almost every incident. He was always present when something bad happened, but somehow he was never held accountable. I began to suspect that he knew more than he let on. His sweaty and nervous appearance started to make more sense. He was hiding something terrible. I confronted Mark on a rainy night, armed with the information I had uncovered. He denied everything at first, but as I pressed him, he began to crumble. He told me that the building was more than just an old, run-down place. It was a portal, a place where the line between our world and the spirit world was thin. The troubled souls of those who had died there never found peace and continued to haunt the place. Mark revealed that he was trapped there, forced to take care of the building and the spirits that inhabited it. He had tried to leave countless times, but he was always pulled back. He said that I was trapped now too, a new piece in the building's macabre puzzle. As he spoke, I realized that his sweaty and nervous appearance was pure despair and resignation. I tried to leave the building that night, but every exit seemed to lead back to my apartment. I was trapped in an endless loop of terror. The walls seemed to close in around me, the whispers turned to screams, and I could feel the cold hands of spirits touching me, pulling me into the darkness. That was the last time I tried to leave. Now, I am writing this as a warning to anyone who reads it. If you find an old building that's too cheap to be true, run. Don't make the same mistake I did. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. If you're reading this, please take my warning seriously. Life has taught me the hardest way that some places carry stories and presences that should never be disturbed. The building I am trapped in is proof of this, a snare of souls and torments that transcend common understanding. Since that day, my existence has been an endless cycle of fear and hopelessness. There is no escape, no relief. Mark was right. I am trapped, just like him, forced to care for a place that should never have housed human lives. With each passing day, I feel my sanity slipping away, as the spirits inhabiting this place pull me deeper into their abyss of despair. If you ever find yourself in a situation where the only option seems to be a place like this, remember my words. It is better to face any other hardship than to succumb to a trap that will never let you go. Some deals are too good to be true, and the prices we pay can be much higher than we can bear. Now, every time I hear the whispers and feel the oppressive cold that permeates this place, I remember the moment I first walked in here, unaware that I was signing my own sentence. I am sharing this in the hope that you can escape the fate that has consumed me. Run while you still can, and never look back. Believe me, the true nightmare begins when you become a part of it. I'm not much of a writer, honestly. The most I've ever written was probably a grocery list, but what happened needs to be put out there somehow. I'm a regular 30-year-old guy, grew up in a small town in Ohio, and never really left. After high school, I jumped between jobs, mostly in retail and a bit in construction. The pay was never great, and the hours were worse, always trying to find something to pay the bills and keep my head above water. About a year ago, an opportunity came up that seemed like a small light at the end of the tunnel. A friend of mine, who lived in a neighboring town, was about to go on vacation and needed someone to look after his house. He offered me the job. I would stay at his place, eat the food that was there, and just needed to make sure the place was safe and clean and water the plants. It was a good deal for someone like me, struggling to find a more stable job. I took it right away, thinking it would be a golden chance to relax a bit and earn some extra cash. When the word got out, I started getting more requests to take care of other people's homes in the community. It was simple but effective. I became the go-to guy for people when they went on trips or needed someone to look after their properties. That's when the job with the Petersons came up, an older couple about to go on a cruise to Florida for 2 weeks. They had a beautiful house on the outskirts of town with a large yard and many windows. It was the kind of place that looked straight out of a home decor magazine, everything well maintained and seemingly perfect. The Petersons seemed friendly, though a bit particular about the upkeep of their home. They gave me a detailed list of instructions. Don't mess with the thermostat too much, keep the back door always locked, and make sure all the plants got the right amount of water. The first few days went exactly as I expected. The house was quiet, and I felt comfortable there. I spent my time watching TV and reading some of the books the Petersons had on the shelves. Everything was in order, and it seemed like a simple and pleasant job. I started to think maybe this was the change I needed in my life until strange things began to happen. But that Thursday night, while I was watching a weekly show I liked, I heard a noise coming from upstairs. The feeling of unease began to settle in, and I didn't know what was about to come. The first few days at the Petersons' house were calm and routine. I felt comfortable, and the house seemed like the perfect place to unwind and escape from my hectic life. But everything began to change subtly, almost imperceptibly at first. At first, it was just small noises that I attributed to the house's old plumbing system. However, as the days went by, these sounds became more frequent and unsettling. It was a Thursday night, and I was settled on the living room sofa, watching a weekly show I had always enjoyed. The sound of the TV filled the room, creating a sense of normalcy and comfort. But then, as the show reached a tense scene, I heard a noise coming from upstairs. The sound was like heavy footsteps, followed by a dragging noise, as if someone was moving furniture. I thought it was the old house settling, perhaps caused by the wind or the weather. I got up and went to the stairs, but the silence had returned by the time I got there. A chill began to settle in, and I forced myself to laugh, trying to shake off the growing discomfort. The house was old, and noises were to be expected, I told myself. That night, the feeling of unease didn't leave me. As the days passed, more noises started to occur. The sound of footsteps became a constant, sometimes even seeming as if something or someone was moving from room to room. What started as a mild discomfort turned into a sense that something was wrong. On several occasions, I would wake in the middle of the night feeling watched, though no one was there when I turned on the light. Additionally, I began to notice other strange things. The back door, which I always kept locked as instructed, sometimes seemed to be slightly ajar when I checked. The plants, which I watered diligently according to the instructions, were inexplicably wilting. Even the thermostat, which I avoided adjusting, seemed to be out of whack occasionally, although I never touched it. The discomfort grew when I started to feel an inexplicable cold in certain rooms, especially upstairs. It was a cold that seemed to have no source, a kind of chill that seeped into the bones. Yet, when I checked the thermometer or adjusted the heating, the temperature was normal. That Thursday night marked the beginning of something I couldn't fully understand. The sounds and sensations were becoming more intense, and I felt that something was hidden, something that was starting to reveal its true face. The feeling of being watched became a constant presence in my mind, and every corner of the house seemed to harbor a dark mystery that I was just beginning to uncover. As the days passed and the strange occurrences intensified, I knew I had to figure out what was causing all this unrest. The feeling of being watched and the incessant noises were consuming me. On a particularly quiet night, I decided it was time to investigate the source of the noises coming from upstairs. The house was dark and silent as I began my investigation. The flashlight's beam trembled in my hands as I climbed the stairs, each step echoing through the empty corridors. The cold seemed to intensify as I approached the upper floor, and the air was heavy with a sense of oppression. First, I went to the Petersons' bedroom. I looked around, trying to find any logical explanation for the noises I had heard. The room was completely silent, but as I ran my hand over the surfaces, I noticed an unusual layer of dust and a musty smell that I hadn't detected before. Everything seemed in place, but the discomfort lingered. The sense that something was wrong grew stronger when I entered the Petersons' office. The shelves were filled with books, and an old cabinet was pushed against the wall. My gaze fell on a small hidden door behind the cabinet. I had never noticed this door before, and it was slightly ajar, as if it had been opened recently and not fully closed. The feeling of dread grew as I carefully pushed open the door. Behind the door was a narrow, dusty staircase leading down to a small basement. I had never imagined that the Petersons' house had a basement, and the idea of exploring that dark, confined space was terrifying. However, curiosity and fear drove me to descend the stairs. The basement was dark, except for the beam of my flashlight piercing the gloom. The atmosphere was heavy and oppressive, and the cold was almost unbearable. As I moved forward, I noticed that the walls were covered with some kind of old smoky graffiti. Strange drawings, symbols, and words I couldn't decipher were etched into the walls, conveying a sense of malevolence and despair. The discovery reached its peak when I found an old chest in the corner of the basement. The chest was covered in dust and spider webs, and its appearance was completely worn with age. With trembling hands, I opened the chest, and what I found inside left me in shock. There was a collection of disturbing old items, photographs of people I didn't recognize, worn clothes, and most unsettling of all, a series of journals filled with confusing and disturbing notes. The pages of the journals were filled with accounts of strange rituals and macabre experiments. The notes described occult practices and invocations, and in some passages spoke about how to keep souls trapped and control what cannot be seen. The words seemed to twist and come alive, and the sense that something was very wrong became almost unbearable. It was then that I started hearing a sound coming from the depths of the basement, a sound that resembled heavy, irregular breathing. My nerves were on edge and the flashlight flickered uncontrollably. I looked around and noticed shadows moving along the walls as if something was approaching. With my heart racing and panic rising, I ran up the stairs and out of the basement. The air was heavier and the strange noises grew louder. The house's doors were closing on their own, and the cold was becoming more penetrating. That night, terror reached its peak. I knew I had to leave the house, but the doors were locked and the windows seemed sealed. The fear of being trapped in a place with an invisible, malevolent presence was overwhelming. The house felt alive, and I was just a pawn in its terrifying game. That was the last night I spent in the Petersons' house. What I discovered in that basement was more than I could bear, and the feeling of being watched and pursued by something I couldn't see became a horrifying reality. I left the house as fast as I could and never went back. To this day, I still feel the cold and dread of that night, and the strange symbols and journals continue to haunt my thoughts. What I discovered in the Petersons' house goes beyond what I can put into words. The basement, filled with mysteries and hidden symbols, revealed a terrifying truth that defies any rational explanation. The feeling of being trapped in a place where evil hides in the shadows and heavy breathing echoes through the hallways is an experience that still haunts me today. Those nights of terror and the inexplicable sounds were just the beginning of a nightmare I couldn't fully comprehend. Since then, every noise, every shadow in my own home reminds me of what I found on that cursed property. The house seemed alive, and the fear of being part of something unexplainable is a feeling that persists in my mind. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more terrifying accounts, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Your support is crucial for us to keep bringing you these horror and mystery stories, and leave a comment below sharing your thoughts or your own macabre experiences. Your participation is important to us and helps keep the channel active and filled with spine-chilling content. Thank you for watching, and remember, not every nightmare ends when you wake up. Until next time, stay vigilant of the shadows lurking in the darkness.